Hi, this is Stu Stover again. So we're picking up kind of where we left off last time, because now we're looking at some rather important concepts for us in America today, not just us, but anybody in the world. And those are inflation and unemployment. And both of those issues have been very much in the news. I mean, they're always in the news, but definitely lately, trying to figure out exactly what do we do about inflation. And one of the things that is so troubling to me is we're struggling to figure out what causes inflation. Now, we never used to struggle with it because we kind of knew what caused inflation, but for a variety of political reasons, it's gotten murky as we do this. So I want to cut through some of the crap on this stuff and get to what I think are the critical issues in terms of inflation. Now, we all know what inflation is. Inflation is the general rise in prices. General. Now, what does that mean, general? It means that some prices are going up, other prices could be going down. There's a ton of complexity in the textbook, so you definitely don't want to look at the textbook on these issues, but the general notion is, are prices in general going up, or are prices in general going down? We track that with something called the market basket. Okay, so you've got roughly 200 items in this market basket that are tracked, and we're looking at the prices every month, every quarter, every year against what they were. And so you're sort of averaging that. And there's a ton of different ways that we manage this process, but all of that should be fairly understandable. So the reason why I wanted to spend a little time on this is the causes of inflation are typically supply and demand oriented. So they're right in our wheelhouse in terms of economics. So understanding the supply, the amount of goods that are put into the marketplace by the business community or whoever, versus how much demand we are pulling from that. And so we talk about cost push as one of the causes of inflation. Now, cost push simply means if you're Pepsi Corp, and you look at the cost of the ingredients that go into making Diet Pepsi, and the costs have gone up, what is Pepsi going to do? They're going to pass those costs on. Now, it could be we have a world sugar shortage or something, which we don't. But the reality is it could be any one of their commodities that is in fact driving up the cost. So cost is critical. We call it push, that it's pushing prices up. On the other side is demand pull. Demand pull simply means you and I as consumers want more goods and we're pulling from the system. So if there's a lot more demand, what are companies going to do? They're going to have a shortage, or theoretically a shortage in what they're supplying to the marketplace, which allows them to raise prices. Okay, so you get this supply and demand, which is straight out of Adam Smith kinds of notions about what causes inflation. So I would argue that that is number one biggest reason for this. Now down here at the bottom, I've got something called supply chain disruptions. And so that would be part of this cost side. So if we can't get the goods into the country, or if we add extra barriers to getting goods into the country, whether that's taxes, tariffs, or just other ways to restrain those goods coming into the country, what's going to happen? We have more demand than we have supply. And obviously prices will go up in that case. And that is what we determine inflation to be. Now, is that the only reason that we have inflation? Of course not. So one of the classic ones that the conservatives tend to always talk about is the supply side. The money supply side. Money supply means is the government printing too much green paper and flooding the society with green bills. Okay. And the idea there is if they do that, putting too much money out into society, it makes money less valuable, forces the price of goods to respond, I don't know, whatever. And the idea is that you can get into some really bad scenarios if the government is playing this game of simply shooting too much money into society. Okay. I would argue that's a minimal one, and I would argue it's minimal because most of our money in America is not in green pieces of paper. It's in blips in the ether. And I just don't see that one as critical. Now, to be fair, if a country gets into hyperinflation, and for those of you who are interested, hyperinflation is a great topic. And I would certainly encourage you to explore that. You've got countries like Zimbabwe, which years ago they changed their name from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. They have been pretty much a basket case country for their entire life as a country. And so they typically are in hyperinflation. So they created at one point $1 trillion bills. $1 trillion so you could buy a loaf of bread? Excuse me. Is something fundamentally wrong with your society if you have to use $1 trillion note to buy a loaf of bread? And the answer is probably. So not to say that this can't be a problem when the government plays this game of trying to solve other problems by simply printing too much cash. But I would argue in America that's probably not going to be one of the top issues. This is obviously, in my opinion, going to be number one. Another one that we hear more from the conservatives is that excessive government spending is causing that. Well, and so what does that mean? So what it means is we're talking about the national debt. And so if the national debt keeps going up, as it has been, so we're in the 35, 36, 37 trillion dollar level, who knows what it is when you watch this video. But the short answer is if there's too much debt out there, doesn't that drive costs up in substantial ways and muck up the system and some significant consequences for that? Now, for the most part, I would argue that this is not a huge issue in terms of what inflation is today. So we're in today, I don't know what it is for you right now, but we're in the 4.2% range. Is that too high? Yeah, as a matter of fact it is. The Federal Reserve, which is primarily responsible for managing this stuff, they're an independent agency, or at least they are at the moment. The Federal Reserve is targeted with making sure inflation doesn't get out of control. Bad things happen when inflation gets out of control, with obviously hyperinflation and other consequences. And so what's going on is that this should be in the 2.5%, 3% range. Now, you might say, shouldn't it be zero? Well, if it's zero, are you going to get a raise at work? Of course not, because aren't your wages connected to inflation in some sense? Of course they are. The value of your house, don't you want the value of your house to go up? And the answer is, of course you do. And so all of those, what we think of as externalities, to go back to an old term we used a few sessions ago, externalities suggest that there are reasons we want some inflation in society. You can also argue that how is a company going to be profitable? I mean, there's going to be some inflation just because they're reflecting wage costs, they're reflecting the cost of the goods that they have to buy to produce the stuff that they ship off to the marketplace. And so the reality is some inflation is frankly not bad. It's just that's a little higher than we'd like. We'd like that a little lower. So for what it's worth, one of the things that's going on here is the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates higher, which we'll talk about Federal Reserve and how that system works later. But they've kept the rates higher because they're worried that if we lower interest rates, what will that stimulate? More spending. More spending means demand pull. And so that we get more pressure on inflation going up. So it's a tricky balance for the Federal Reserve to sort this out, because on the one hand they want this to be lower, But if they keep interest rates too high, there's other consequences for the broader economy. So it gets a little swirly as we sort out that stuff. A couple more that I wanted to mention here, guys. Shrinkflation and greed inflation. These are a couple terms that have showed up in the last couple of years. So one of the things that we've noticed, a lot of companies have gone to, ice cream would be an example. We used to have half-gallon cartons of ice cream. What do we have today? They're not half-gallon. They're about 2/3 of that. Is the price still the same or higher than they were when they were a half-gallon? Yeah. And so shrinkflation means you charge typically the same price or maybe even higher for a smaller quantity. What does that do? It gives you and I as consumers less goods, but it also provides more profit for the corporation or the company that's doing that stuff. Do I think this is a huge issue? No, but it's part of the equation of how we think about inflation. Greedflation simply means that if you got a monopoly or you've got substantial market power, so you're an oligopoly, handful of companies kind of control your sector of the economy, can you raise prices? Well, of course you can, because your competitors, I use that term loosely, are going to raise their prices too. And so everybody raises their prices and profits go up. What a deal. It's great. But was it based on any of these other factors? Probably not. It was just based on, Wall Street wanting higher profits and, other factors out there. Some of the CEOs wanted bigger bonuses or, who knows what might be going on. So I would argue these two are important. They're just lesser important than some of the other factors. A big one, guys, and we don't see this as much in America, we track productivity. So the notion is, how much can a worker produce in a given set of time? Can they produce more today than they could yesterday or last year, 10 years ago? And so we like to see productivity going up. Well, what happens if productivity goes down for a whole host of reasons which would cause it to go down? That is typically another one of the reasons why you can have inflation. So for what it's worth, guys, it's pretty straightforward. If we understand supply and demand, you've got the bulk of the understanding of what causes inflation. Understanding the other pieces is helpful, and you should, because it's more complex than just supply and demand, but it's important to realize how this plays out. I get irritated with the folks who say, yep, inflation is all caused by excessive government spending, and if we just get rid of it, no, that's a piece of the puzzle, and it's a capitalist system. It's not, anyway. So the short answer is there's some logic that happens there. So let's talk about consequences.